Thank you, Rodrigo, and welcome everyone. My name is Marco Adria from the University of Alberta, and I've been one of the people working on developing the Centre for Public Involvement at the University of Alberta, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a moment, but I want to acknowledge the other partners, our main partner for this evening, University of Alberta International, along with the City of Edmonton, and of course Penn State, which is where our guest tonight, John Gastil, comes from. I'm welcoming you in the room here, and we're so delighted that you've come out to be part of tonight's event. But we also welcome 90 participants who are online as we speak, and those people are from 8 countries: Brazil, U.S., Canada, Australia, UK, Philippines, Italy, and one other one that I'm not sure about. But we have many, many people online who are able to follow what's going on tonight, and they will actually be have the opportunity to be part of the question and answer session a little bit later. The Centre for Public Involvement, because we're a relatively new organization, I want to tell you a little bit about it. The Centre for Public Involvement is a collaboration between the University of Alberta and the City of Edmonton. So many research institutes kind of go off and do very important work and tell the world about that work. We want to do that too, but we're doing it in collaboration with our municipal government partners. So we carry out projects on a shared basis. And so one of the projects that we organized a couple of years ago was called the Citizen Panel, where we brought together a randomly selected group of citizens to talk about city budget priorities. Those well considered and discussed over a number of weeks, those well considered recommendations from those 60 citizens were then presented to City Council for consideration, and Council knew that was coming, and there was a good feedback loop there between citizens and our elected representatives. So that's the kind of project that the Centre for Public Involvement is working on with the city, and so we encourage you to follow the progress of the Centre for Public Involvement in collaboration with the City of Edmonton. I'm going to introduce our guest shortly, our speaker. But before I introduce John Gastil, we have a very special guest tonight as part of the proceedings. Councillor Karen Leibovici is from Ward 5 in the City of Edmonton. She's been, along with her council colleagues, she's been really encouraging the City of Edmonton through its administrative staff, through its partnership with the Centre for Public Involvement, to kind of raise the bar on public involvement. The City of Edmonton carries out many, many public involvement processes, something like 300 of them a year. But Karen is one of these people who would like us to become a national leader, if not an international leader, in these public involvement processes. Doing things better, perhaps using technology to its best effect, and ensuring that the City of Edmonton become part of the decision-making process and that our communities become stronger as a result. As you probably know, Karen has been with City Council since 2001, re-elected in 2004, 2007, 2010, and as such, she's one of the senior members of Council, and I just want to welcome her tonight on your behalf.
Senior sounds like I should be retiring. And so I'm here on behalf of the Mayor and Council, and it's a pleasure to be here as part of the University of Alberta's International Week. And I'd also like to recognize a few people that are in the audience. One, a former City Councillor, Michael Fair, and we all know and love Michael, and also Eileen Sinclair, who's our City Clerk, and for whom this is very important. There's other city staff here as well that I'm aware of. And thank you to the organizers of the International Week for their hard work and dedication in pulling this event together. I understand that International Week has become an important forum for discussion on a variety of global issues. And this week's theme, Living Democracy, Citizen Power in a Global Age, will hopefully encourage us all to be more active in decision-making processes, will allow us to learn and create new ways to bring citizens' voices more directly into public policy, and offer a global perspective on these very important public issues. At the City of Edmonton, we are always looking for new and innovative ways to engage our citizens and also to encourage public involvement. And as Marco had indicated just earlier, in an effort to further these objectives, the City of Edmonton and the University of Alberta created the Centre for Public Involvement, and for the last, is it a year and a half, 2 years now, Marco and Fiona have been the heart and soul of that centre. So I'd like to thank you for making it what it is today and positioning it in such a way so that we can and will be leaders both nationally and internationally. So I just wanted to thank you both, and I think we should just give them a little hand here. Thank you. This center is dedicated to leadership and excellence in the theory and practice of encouraging citizen participation and works hard to attract expertise from government, the community, and academia, like we have here tonight, to explore and test alternative involvement practices. We all believe that working together, that this will increase the public involvement capacity of both the City of Edmonton and the University of Alberta, and it will make our knowledge and expertise available to a variety of organizations and institutions. What the Centre does is it encourages the exploration of a variety of public involvement methods that inspire citizens to engage in decision-making processes, help attract a broader, more diverse group of citizens to become involved, promotes thoughtful dialogue that looks for common ground, and leads to decisions, we all hope, that are more credible, acceptable, and sustainable to the majority of our citizens. And one of the great examples of this partnership, and it actually helped to influence Council's decision-making, was the pilot project that Marco had indicated, but that was conducted in 2009. The project established a citizens panel, which was Edmonton's first attempt at participatory budgeting. And with the help of a panel of randomly selected Edmontonians who met once a week for 6 weeks to discuss the city's spending priorities and provide informed views on how to invest municipal tax dollars, direction was provided to Council. There were 2 new directions that were provided to Council, as well as 4 recommendations for Council consideration in setting the 2010 and 2011 budget. And I believe that we did follow what the recommendations were of that panel. It proved to me that the citizen panel is one way that we can engage with and we can strengthen the interconnectedness of community life and really encourage citizens to become more involved in our decision-making process. I think it was a great success, and I look forward to continuing with this approach and improving the connection between government and especially civic government, which is the closest government to people and our citizens. Through the City of Edmonton's partnership with the University of Alberta and the Centre for Public Involvement, we are one step closer to the vision of a living democracy. It's exciting to have Professor Gastil here, one of North America's foremost experts on deliberative democracy. And welcome to Edmonton, yes. And you are here so that we can learn how we, in fact, can have more ability to engage in these processes. And I look forward to a very informative evening, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Councillor Libovici. As I introduce John, I'll just mention that he's an observer of the social life, so he's got lots of observations already in hand about differences in Canadian culture and U.S. culture. He's a great watcher of The Simpsons and has an encyclopedic knowledge of the characters and characterization that you see in The Simpsons. course, among the differences between the U.S. and Canada, you know, they call, when we talk about a tuna sandwich or a tuna salad, they say tuna fish. They say tuna fish sandwich. And the only thing I can think about that, John, is that, you know, we know it's a fish. So we don't need that thing at the end. John is at the... John Gastil is at the University of Pennsylvania State and is head and professor of communication arts and sciences. And so what that means is, in addition to his teaching and the research and travel that he does to venues like this, he has administrative duties at Penn State. And so you realize that he has lots of things to do, but for a couple of red-eye flights that we offered him and some free internet at the hotel, he decided he'd come here. So we're very, very grateful that he could be here today, because he's in great demand around the world. The reason for that is that John not only has done very rigorous studies of, for example, the outcomes of jury procedures, how groups of citizens come together to make important decisions, and what the outcomes of that are for those citizens and their friends and neighbors in terms of the values that might change as a result of being part of a jury. He does research in that area, but also in looking at larger scale citizen deliberation. So known as an academic expert in that area. But I think what you'll hear tonight as well is he's very passionate about citizen involvement. So he will probably describe himself something as being somewhat of an observer apart from the situation, but really he's been very close to and part of many citizen involvement initiatives. For example, I drove up to Vancouver to be part of the famous BC Citizens Assembly and just watch and be part of that. So I think you'll get a sense that this is someone who loves citizen involvement, that has a passion for democracy, and so he's bringing something of that involvement to his very widely known research. So we're happy to have him here today, and eventually we hope to ask him to be on our expert advisory panel at the Center for Public Involvement. So we hope that he will be an ongoing part of the Center's development. But with that, I'm going to invite John to come forward, and as well, just so that you know, we have Asia behind you. You might not be able to see her; she's not that tall, but she's managing the computer back here. So thank you, Asia. Thank you, John, and welcome to the University of Alberta.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm so glad you could make it here today. On this first slide, you see a constellation of entities here in Edmonton. I just want to stress that we're going to be going around the world to look at some different examples of deliberation and democracy, but you really do have a special opportunity here in Edmonton to create some innovative things. This idea of a partnership between the university and the city is quite unusual at the degree of integration they have. And if you're interested in more about that, you can talk to anyone, but the Center for Public Involvement, I think, is a great place to get started. And thank you to everyone. It's great to be a part of International Week. Had some wonderful conversations. Gramsci has come up twice in the last 2 days, which is a lot more than it has in a while for me. I want to give a special shout out to those who are online, especially the person from the other country. They weren't sure what that was. So you can pretend you're from anywhere when you send in a question. I personally hope it's Slovenia, because it's a cool place. But what you're missing is, I know you don't have a live video feed of me. I'm actually wearing a plaid suit with a green sash. And the audience is all in orange. I think it's something about Occupy Edmonton. I wish you could see that, but it's, you know, that's too bad. The other thing is, those of you online, I guarantee you, we're going to get 4 glimpses of democracy's future, but in 30 minutes or less. And as I promised online, if I don't make it under 30 minutes, I will renew for free 1 month of your World of Warcraft account. So we start with a quote. As I understand it, a quote that helped inspire the theme for International Week this year comes from Francis Moore from the previous session. The quote is, we need to explore democracy as a way of life, no longer something done to us or for us, but what we ourselves create. I love that sentiment, but if I can be a nerd, and trust me, I can, I want to make sure that we is pretty broadly encompassing, because when I see a quote like this and I get in the spirit of it and I look at the things going on around me here in International Week, it's easy to think of we as active citizens, this special group of people. We're going to do something, we're going to take our government back, we're going to create a social movement, and all those things are fantastic. As it happens, today's talk involves governments and citizens, those same citizens, but working in partnership with government. What I mean to say is that when you look at some of the most important transformations in our society, and certainly transformations in democracy, you often see enlightened public officials making key strategic decisions, taking risks in concert with the support of public. And so again, we are going to create a new kind of democracy, but I just want to make clear, I think that we is going to involve some pretty boring people and institutions that you mostly like to hate. So when I say I'm going to talk about deliberative democracy, I want to start just by saying let's not get carried away. It is sort of a kind of movement thing. I mean, it is a global thing, and it's exciting, and it's happening, and you can't stop it, and that's all cool, but it's actually kind of boring. It really is. It's a revolution in procedural fairness. All right? It's not actually about the economy, and I understand there's economic problems, but it actually does have tremendous fiscal power. It's not really about the environment. And I know the earth is burning and we're going to die, but it does actually create better public policy on the environment. And it's not actually overthrowing any dictators. This isn't exactly spring. This isn't exactly the Middle East. But it can happen there any time of year. Once you have an electoral process, you start to think, well, that was cool, but maybe I need something more. Maybe there's a better kind of democracy, and that's what it's really about. It's about changing what we mean when we say we want a democracy. Specifically saying, oh yeah, I think we need some deliberation. So we just came a few minutes ago from a debate on Occupy Wall Street and whether it should have a focused topic. Best reference to the movie The Blob I've ever heard came from that debate, which was wonderful. But the first speaker said, I'm going to define my terms. And I thought, oh my God, you are such a nerd. And I thought, I have to do that too. So deliberative democracy. I got a rep here, people. A deliberative democracy is a modern political system that meets the basic requirements of democratic elections, but also features public institutions, cultural norms, and citizen participation that all support a deliberative, reflective, informed, respectful process for solving collective problems. And let's be clear, respect doesn't mean you can't disagree, or you can't even get angry. It doesn't mean that. It just means that we maintain a broader theme of civility, mutual respect, and trying to work through problems together. Not always reaching consensus, but reflective, informed, deliberative democracy. That's what this movement is all about. Now, I go straight to the jury. I told you it would be boring. Look at this jury. I mean, they're not going to have a good day. I suspect it's a civil trial, a malpractice suit. It's probably frivolous. But nonetheless, they're going to render a verdict. And what I think is so incredible, for all the complaints and caricatures we have of the jury, it just does its thing. It just does its thing. In the United States, when you were accused of committing a crime, you know there's a jury down the road should you go there. You've got some other options, but that's incredible. You go all around the world to so many countries and people think, that's interesting and incredibly dumb. But we say no. We actually believe that there is this institution where random, semi-random citizens come together and render judgments on things they knew nothing about before the trial. I mean, complex corporate crimes, the jury renders a verdict. That's incredible. And what I'm trying to say is when deliberative democracy, you'll know it has won when things like the jury are all over the place and boring and taken for granted. That's when we'll know we've won. The revolution will not be televised because it will have already happened and it's boring. But the jury is exceptional. I grant that. It is actually an exceptional body, and that's part of the reason it's overlooked. But today's talk is going to look at some new company the jury has. There's actually some new institutions. They're becoming real institutions, and it's exciting to see it happen. And seeing them, glimpsing them, gives us an idea of what this deliberative democracy might start to look like. And again, we're going to see real governments working hand in hand with citizens who are wanting to change their world. So speaking of that world, let's go ahead and jump in there. We're going to go first to the place farthest from where we are here in Alberta. We'll go down to Kerala in the southwestern corner of India. Kerala is actually we're just going to go right to the airport, just to land kind of safely there on the first slide. I wasn't sure where to go, but I just wanted a tarmac. It's been the site of tremendous political and socioeconomic reform in the past 50 years. If you don't know much about India, trust me, people who know a lot about India say, oh, Kerala, that's completely different. And it's like, well, fine, okay, but it's India. It's still India. But it really does have quite a distinctive history that is partly of its own making. Kerala has life expectancy, literacy, education, standard of living rates that are quite apart from most of the other parts of India. And actually exceeds many of the standards of what we would call developed countries. Has a large urban and dispersed rural population. And sometimes gets accused of exceptionalism, as I said. But as a friend of mine from India has observed, Kerala is just like the rest of India in that it kind of exists simultaneously in multiple centuries. And so it has tremendous complexity, tremendous diversity, and terrible histories of marginalization and oppression for several populations. But Kerala has done something incredible, and the reason it gets our first glimpse of the future of deliberative democracy is this. We're just going to do some glimpsing here, so we have this quick little timeline. But you got to understand that in 1993, a couple amendments to the Constitution in India really changed things. And the stress was placed on the importance of local government and devolution, which created an opportunity to have more powerful local government, something that actually in India was quite a new concept of local governance. When I went to do a workshop there, I answered all kinds of questions. We had all kinds of great high-level discussions, but I also wanted to talk about things like municipal waste. Who's responsible for that? And just conceptualizing different ways of doing local government is still kind of a lively debate in many parts of India. But Kerala figured it out for themselves. In 1996, a left-wing party in Kerala was elected and implemented a decentralization pledge. This was their theme. That's what they said we're going to do. And they delivered on that promise with the People's Plan campaign. Ultimately, we've mobilized through this process, I'm not included in that, we as the collective of people doing it, 2 million participants, 160 per Gram Sabha. And a Gram Sabha is essentially a village council. It's sort of the smallest unit. And there is a multi-layered process in the People's Plan where the Gram Sabha looks at the state budget, and ultimately about a third of the development budget, we're talking about huge sums of money, is going through these small Gram Sabhas and going on up from there. The participation in those meetings is very open, somewhat loosely structured. Unfortunately, it's not that well researched at the real micro level, which I think is a real disappointment. But the number of people participating in these has just multiplied dramatically over the first few years. So it's an incredible example of really getting a huge number of people connected to direct policy making in a country that had no tradition really of strong local government, at least in the modern era. But there are problems. There's no doubt there are problems. When we say there's a mass mobilization, 2 million sounds pretty good, but that's about 10%. The middle class and people with higher levels of education have tended to start dropping out of the process. There's disproportionate participation by people who happen to be affiliated with the local party at any one immediate area, so there tends to be kind of a skewed participation. And interestingly, there's been a great analysis of what was the money actually spent on through these. Women and lower castes have benefited tremendously in terms of the allocation being shifted towards concerns specifically to those groups, but their numbers as participants is still quite low and disproportionate. So thanks for the favor, but we're not quite there. Let's just say we started there, and let's now move on. Let's kind of go across the ocean and look at something that bears some resemblances to the People's Plan, but maybe more familiar to many of you, and that's participatory budgeting in Brazil. We're going to start in Porto Alegre, which is where we're landing here, but we're not going to stay there. Porto Alegre is a large delta city. Brazilian, it's a state capital. Yeah, okay, yeah, you want to play some music. Good for you. It has a very active port, large population. It's actually best known outside Brazil, really for participatory budgeting. It has a lot more going on, but when you hear Porto Alegre outside of Brazil, the conversation is usually going to go something like this. We're going to talk about what happened in Brazil when, again, there was a constitutional change that triggered a dramatic change in how money was allocated. Go back to 1988 in the Brazilian Constitution. The Workers' Party that same year in Porto Alegre sees an opportunity. They campaign, here's that theme again, they campaign on democratic reform, an inversion of spending priorities. We need to focus the money on the most local problems. And they're quite successful. When they're reelected in 1992, you kind of got the feeling that they're onto something. And again, I want to underscore, we can say that the Workers' Party officials who came up with that campaign idea, we can say they were enlightened, that they wanted deliberative democracy and they were ahead of the curve. But we can also just say they were just the same mean old SOBs that run every political party, but they were shrewd. There's nothing wrong with political strategy and democratic ideals going hand in hand. And they've been tremendously successful in Porto Alegre. Just as we saw with the Kerala example, it really amounted to a mass mobilization. You're getting 20,000 people a year into these very local meetings. And again, as you're going to see in a video in just a second, there's going to be a multi-layered process. But at these very local levels, you're getting a huge number of people participating. And in this case, unlike Kerala, we actually have an over-representation of the poorest of the poor because they were very consciously mobilizing those populations to come to the meetings. By 1999, you get this 20,000 figure, but by 2002, you've really got participatory budgeting entrenched in Porto Alegre. Now, as I said, we're not going to stay in Porto Alegre. We're actually going to move to Recife, which is in another part of Brazil. But before we go to the video, I just want to say why Recife is now on our radar. 2001, they start fooling around with participatory budgeting, and they do an incredibly good job with it. Such a good job that in 2011, a German civic association awarded a prize for kind of the best innovation in participation in democracy. And the competition was brutal. A couple of the processes you're seeing up here were near the top of the finalists. This was the winner. This process was, they thought, the most effective in the world. So let's just take a quick glimpse. I like these little short videos because you get a little bit of feel for the texture of what this actually looks like and how you organize it, where people sit and so on. So.
Every year, municipal authorities set up a participatory budget where citizens can bring in their own suggestions, particularly for urban development measures in their region. A comprehensive network of helpers informs the residents accordingly. In meetings in all regions of the city, the citizens can then choose 10 of the suggested projects for their micro-region. In plenary forums on special topics, they can also decide which measures should be implemented in the 15 political areas, such as education, youth, senior citizens, and culture. In contrast to the regional forums, programs for the entire city are developed here. Both in the regional and plenary forums, the participants subsequently elect delegates who accompany the further process and dispatch members to a budget advisory council. This council drafts the budget on the basis of the selected projects, which is then passed by the municipal council. So that the citizens can also be involved in the implementation of the projects, a commission is set up for every measure. Since the introduction of the participatory budget, more than 3,000 projects with a value of 220 million euros have been implemented, mainly in the poor regions. In 2010, more than 100,000 people participated in this process.
So, as you can see, again, it's another example of participatory budgeting. You get a sense for the scale of it. I mean, we really are talking about, when we start aggregating these across different places, we're talking about billions of dollars, and we're talking about dramatic changes in how money is being spent. It's actually, of all these processes, this is the one that's kind of caught on across the globe, and that's exciting, as this is a map just showing all kinds of places that have one kind of participatory budgeting or another. But let's go to the downsides again for a second. Sure, it's copied all over the globe, but just like when you copy things in a sci-fi movie, right? About the 5th or 6th copy starts sounding kind of weird and squirrely and has like 12 arms, and it's supposed to only have one. And that's what's happening with participatory budgeting to some degree. One of the biggest sort of copy problems is people see the process and say, that sounds cool, and leave the process completely advisory. which means that now expectations have been raised quite high, and they might be asking for things that can't be delivered for various legal reasons or fiscal reasons, and there's a breakdown. And you can actually wind up causing more harm than good because now you've delegitimized the deliberative process that does work when you hook it up right. There's also been a problem in that sometimes it does become a mobilization contest. It's a question of who can get their peeps there and press hard enough for one interest or another, and that may not be in the larger public interest. And it's for that reason that some people have turned to processes like the third and fourth that we're about to see, where they actually try using some random sampling, which you heard mentioned in earlier comments. And that presents its own problems, but it creates a tremendous advantage in terms of the representativeness of who participates. So to get a sense for that, let's go ahead and jump forward and take a look at our third process. We'll leave Brazil here, and we'll just kind of shoot our way up into Canada. Kind of go through Central America. Oh, did you see that Grand Canyon? You missed it? Oh, well, I'll keep the window open. And here we are in Vancouver. We're very happy that the video is working. The audio was kind of a 50-50, but you would have heard right now is a song from the show Due South, the most successful Canadian show to have been brought to the United States. Indeed, a national treasure. The hero of that show, he's been called that, Paul Gross, would have been singing to you, in fact, a song about Alberta, appropriately enough. Or not, since we're in Vancouver. But, you know, I thought we'd let that slide, because it's, oh, there you go. Get a little music. The British Columbia, Vancouver, was the host to the Citizens' Assembly, and it was an incredible innovation in that it was the first time we'd seen a random sample of citizens gathered together to actually create legislation. And how did it come about is kind of bizarre. It really gets back to somebody teaching a class who was kind of talking to students about an idea and the Greeks and random sampling and so on. Meanwhile, there's a whole literature on deliberative democracy emerging. They knew nothing about it. They just kind of said, hey, you know, what about this idea? And it got to a party official and they said, let's campaign on it, and you get yourself this little timeline, okay? So let's talk about the BC Liberals just for a second. In 1996, they had themselves a very frustrating election. They got 42% of the vote. It sounds okay, but actually it was a plurality. Nobody got more. That 42% earned them 33 of the 72 votes in the Assembly. That's got to be annoying. You get more votes than anyone else, and you wind up with a minority share. So when they campaigned, they kicked in this idea, among other things, and said, we might use this, random sample assembly thing to change the electoral system, try to make it more fair. Well, they got kind of stuck because in 2001, they got 58% of the vote. That was great, but they got 77 out of 79 seats because, remember, the system doesn't work quite well. So they were kind of like, oh, yeah, let's change the system, which just totally advanced us. But it was cool. They did. They held a citizens' assembly. They got the thing established in 2003. 2004, the assembly deliberates. We're going to get a glimpse of what they did. And then in 2005, that assembly's recommendation for a new way of counting votes was put to a vote of the whole province. So let's take a look at this thing they cooked up in practice and just kind of get a feel for what it looked like.
British Columbia has become one of our leader in involving citizens in public policy development. When our province created the Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform in 2003, it was a historic event. Never before had democracy given randomly selected citizens so much power. The 160 members of the Assembly were all volunteers who were randomly selected from the voters' list. 80 men and 80 women came from every area of the province in all walks of life. The Citizens' Assembly was given a unique and important job: learn and make recommendations about the way our governments are elected. The first stage of their work was to study and examine electoral systems used in democracies around the world. They met from January to March of 2004 to hear from experts and learn about different voting systems. 50 public hearings were held during May and June 2004 in communities throughout BC, allowing Assembly members to hear what their fellow citizens had to say.
So after those public hearings, they get to the point where they're crystallizing a final recommendation, and that final recommendation was single transferable vote. Show of hands, how many people know with full confidence that you could describe to this room what single transferable vote is in about 3 minutes or less? For those on the web, I don't know if your hands are up, but there's about 8 hands up here out of an audience of thousands. Thanks a lot. You got my back there, people. Let's just say not many people raised their hand. Well, as it happens, single transferable vote is a pretty cool kind of technical way of counting votes. And when they said they heard from people from around the world, I just wanted you to get your head around that. You're one of these randomly selected 150 people in that beautiful facility you saw there, right? That's from the Simon Fraser University downtown campus, the Center for Dialogue. What a beautiful thing that is. But you've got these experts flying in from around the world to talk to you. And if you raise your hand and say, okay, slow down, Poindexter, when you say transferable vote, you lost me. Okay, we got all the time in the world. Let's slow it down, right? Let's talk about it. And they understood exactly what it meant. I guarantee you they did. But just what an honor to have all these people working with you all the time you need to work through that. They came up with a very wonky recommendation. And in 77 of the 79 ridings in British Columbia, it got a majority of the vote. Overall, it got 57% of the vote. Now, they needed 60% for it to pass. So the net effect was to not change the electoral system. There's just another glimpse of that facility. Well, Ontario thought, okay, that was actually pretty sweet. We want to do that. So Ontario held a Citizens' Assembly in 2007. The recommendation that came out of that body got 37% of the vote. British Columbia said, yeah, well, you know what, we thought our assembly was awesome, but our election was kind of pathetic. This time I'm going to actually give money, the government said, to the pro and con. We'll have a better debate, and we'll talk it through. I know it's getting kind of stale, but, you know, it's sitting on top of the fridge. Somebody's got to eat it. 2009, it gets 38% of the vote. Now, one of the reasons it did as well as it did is survey research has showed that as many as a third of the people who supported the single transferable vote, like many of the people in this room said, not sure what that is, but I do understand how the recommendation came about. It was this random sample. It was cool. People like me, they said it's a good idea. I'll figure out what it is once it's, you know, the new law, but I'm voting for it. Fast forward a few years and it's like, the what did who now? And you're down to 38% support. But it's an interesting example of the power of this deliberative cue, that one deliberative body can kind of signal to a larger body some interesting ideas, but maybe it would be better if more information came in that signal, and we're going to see that in just a second. The other thing that's kind of problematic about it, looking back on it, some of the people involved in it said we were too far apart from government. I mean, you'd think it wants to be separate from government, right? But the problem was it really distanced itself such that even the BC Liberals who had sponsored it were kind of like, yeah, we created this process, and then you're like, we don't want to talk to you. And, you know, it felt kind of snippy. In the end, they came up with a solution. Their only goal was to come up with the best voting system for British Columbia. In retrospect, I would suggest there's 2 criteria. That's the first one, the best system. Second criterion, that people can understand easily, right? I mean, I understand you don't want to dumb it down too much, but did you have to go for single transferable vote? Anyway, I'm just saying, you got to think about the political reality. And this next process we're going to see does that in a different way. But fortunately for our little flights around the world, we don't have to go too far. All we have to do is just kind of go down a little bit from British Columbia through the state of Washington, where I lived for many years, wonderful place you should visit, to Salem, Oregon, the capital there. In Salem, Oregon, we have the Citizens Initiative review process, and it's a pretty neat example of what you can do. This is just a picture of the state capitol. Let me give you a little context for Oregon. 1902, they established the referendum and initiative process. It was kind of a hip and sexy thing to do, but they were still early enough that they could say, like, we knew that band before you thought it was cool. So they were already passing some things by ballot that were pretty revolutionary. Women's suffrage in 1912 was done through the ballot in Oregon. They abolished the death penalty in 1914. And many, many other ballot measures on taxes, environment, health, crime, you name it, have come through the state of Oregon. So it was a great place to try a new deliberative process that could improve direct democracy. Now, again, this starts with kind of a person who had an idea. In this case, it gets a little more personal because it's actually a friend of mine. Ned Crosby here. Let me show you a picture of him. No. The next one, not that Crosby. Ned Crosby. There we go. Okay. Slide error, my mistake. the Jefferson Center for New Democratic Processes, he started back in 1974 and created something called the citizens jury. If you study this deliberation stuff, that'll come up pretty quickly, that term, and like participatory budgeting, it's copied, sometimes with weird sci-fi effects, but it's copied all over the world. It's one of the most commonly used terms to describe a deliberative body in countries that have a jury system, because again, the jury is something we can connect to and say, oh, like a jury. Well, yeah, kind of, sort of. But you do what you can when you're working with metaphors. When we look at the history, we have to fast forward from 1974 all the way to 2009. And the reason we have to take so long is Ned worked on these citizen juries on policy questions for years and years and years. Eventually, he became frustrated. He felt like they weren't having necessarily an impact. They weren't necessarily connected to real electoral outcomes. And he created this process that a couple folks in Oregon with public policy degrees said sounded cool. And they got the legislature to adopt it. They just lobbied the heck out of the thing. An interesting detail is the legislature passed it in 2009, right? Everybody's broke. So they say, we'll establish this process, but we won't give you a dime. You're going to have to pay for it through philanthropic fundraising and so on, which they've done, but it's just a little worry note to plant there. So 2010, they did the CIR. We're going to see that in a second. And in 2011, Oregon, with a perfectly divided legislature in at least one house, then is going to review it because they passed it for just one try to be, sunsetted and then looked at again later. So let's take a look at what this process actually looked like.
Reflects the entire state election got over 5 days to review and measure on the ballot. Through the process, I never knew who was Republican or who was a Democrat.
We have always felt educational level of responsibility to the process and contributed in powerful and valuable ways.
Always illustrated with the facts and issues. For each 5-page review, a panel recommended questions campaigns for and against the legislature, heard from background experts, and then deliberated together based on the facts. We issued their findings to every voter in the state through a proper 2-page in the statewide voter stamp.
So this is just a picture of the little ending press conference here. I just want to reiterate what exactly it is they did. You're voting as an Oregon voter on all kinds of questions, and it's actually a vote by mail state now. So you get these ballots along with a voter's guide, and you have to vote on policy, on a lot of different and sometimes very complex policies. The CIR got to study a couple of those, 2 different panels, 2 different issues, for a full week, and really grill the proponents and the opponents of these measures. Measure 73 is the one we're going to look at, and at the end of their week, they did a press conference and issued their kind of findings and observations. But like so many of these processes, if they end with a press conference, you might as well have not done it. It was covered a little bit here and there. I mean, what's the news value? The point was that voter's pamphlet. That's the incredible innovation here. These are mailed to, again, every registered household. And historically, it's had some information, a little technical summary, an estimate of fiscal impact. But now there was a new page written by your fellow citizens who studied the bejesus out of this thing a lot longer than you're going to have time to do. And they came up with some insights. Well, in the end, we found that about 40% of the Oregon electorate found out about this page. All right, so stay with me there. A majority of Oregonians actually never did quite reach that thing. So first time it was tried, didn't quite reach half, but we're up to 40%. That's about 4 times what we were getting when we started back in Caroline. Measure 73's support was incredibly high. It was a mandatory minimum law, and Oregon loves them some tough on crime. And this was tough on a couple crimes, drunk driving and sexual assaults. It was very unpleasant. And Oregonians love the idea of tougher minimum sentences on that. Support for that measure dropped pretty dramatically in the course of the election. It didn't change the outcome in the end, but support dropped as you're going to see in a little bit. Did the CIR account for that? Did it have anything to do with that? Well, that's really part of what we were researching. We did some online surveys, and we did a ton of huge rolling cross-section phone surveys. So we surveyed the poor state to death. One of the interesting findings was just how carefully they read that page. When you ask them how much time they spent reading different things in the voter's guide, if they did see that CIR page, as about 42% did, they spent at least kind of twice as long reading that as they did anything else. All these old pieces of information, the explanatory summary, the arguments for and against which are literally bought and paid for in the voter's guide. That's exactly what they are. So they were reading it, but did that make any difference? Did it affect them? We did, the coolest experiment I think in this whole study was this. You're about to see in this slide, my favorite slide of the day. It was an experiment in the online survey when we were coming to people late in the election. So these are real voters in Oregon who are about to vote. They have their voter's guide, but they haven't voted yet. And they haven't read their voter's guide yet. We're going to, I just haven't gotten to it. Okay, well, we're interviewing you now, so answer some questions if you would, please. And this is a web survey, which is perfect. In the first condition that I call no treatment, that nothing happens. We just say, oh, so how are you going to vote on this measure, Measure 73, which has the following title? As you can see, almost 70%, roughly two-thirds are saying, I'm voting for it. I am tough on crime. Yeah. The second experimental condition, a different quarter of these people were randomly put in this condition where instead of being asked immediately how they're going to vote, they first saw this letter from the Secretary of State, which was completely irrelevant to the question we were about to ask. But in experiments, you do these things, so they have to read something. And then we ask them, and of course, they say the same thing, right? This group also, two-thirds, say, yeah, we're tough on crime. It's Oregon. We love it. Woo! Third condition gets to traditional voter guide information. We gave them a page. We said, whoop, we're not going to ask any questions until you read a summary of Measure 73 and the fiscal impact. Now what do you think? I love this. This is tough on crime. I'm all over it. You know where we're going. Of these people, one quarter were randomly assigned to the Citizens Initiative review page. That was all they saw before we asked them the question. And here's your result. Yeah. The tide turns violently against Measure 73. Now, the story is actually more interesting than this. Reading the CIR page didn't just make almost 60% now opposed to it. It did a couple other things. When other people read the summary and the fiscal statement, they became incredibly confident that they now had the information they need to make an informed judgment. And they were very quick to say, yes, I support. When you ask a survey question like this, yes or no, you often get into these sort of, well, I'm not sure, okay, but if you had to. These people didn't need that. Yes, I support it. The people who read the CIR statement were no more confident that they had all the information that they needed. And were actually hesitant to say yes or no, but when pushed, would say, well, if you're going to push me, I got to say no. The burden of proof had shifted. It hadn't brainwashed them. It had just made them stop and think and say, hold on, maybe I don't know what Measure 73 really is. That, I would argue, is actually more valuable than simply just swaying them in the opposite direction. Well, no suspense. In 2011, when the legislature looked back at the CIR, they decided this is going to become a permanent institution in the state of Oregon. It passed the House 36-22 in a House that was 50-50 Democrat and Republican with co-speakers. In the Senate, a 16-14 divide, they voted 22-8 in favor. And then it was signed by the governor in June. It's pretty incredible that this thing has been secured in legislation. It might spread. It might. Arizona is having to come out in March to talk about this idea. Some folks in California are talking about it. But it is not without its blemishes. It didn't change any electoral outcomes. In both of the initiative cases, it shifted public opinion, but not to change the net result. So we have still yet to see that. And we don't know how well it will translate to other states. So let's kind of wrap up here just by kind of taking away a couple sort of cocktail moment thoughts that you can take out of this talk to explain to people why you're so much smarter than them because you came here. Those are the four processes: the People's Plan, participatory budgeting, Citizens Assembly, Citizens Initiative Review. But you can kind of think of them in two clusters, as you probably already sensed. The first two of those, they have a special constitutional foundation. Constitutional amendments kind of facilitated their arrival. Political parties seized on them at the right time and created a process that was designed for mobilization. And therein lies some of its challenge, that it really is kind of a political mobilization process, and it's only as strong as your political process is. The other two processes, again, use random samples, and that creates some of its own problem. On the one hand, it's a very representative body, and they have a very cool and structured process that they can do incredible analysis to either create legislation or very rigorously evaluate it. But there is no energy that comes out of it. There's no mobilization connected to it. So it's an open question as to whether the public will trust its judgment or bother to read its analysis. We go back to the quote from Francis Moore-Lepay to remind ourselves that we are creating this new democracy, this deliberative democracy, and to remind you again that the we, as I argue in these cases, is most effective when it really is inclusive. It's inclusive of people who are passionate about social change, passionate about personal transformation, and other people who are boring and are institutionalized or are politically strategic but not interested in mass mobilization. There can be alliances and partnerships among those people that can create incredible things. In some ways, we have them to thank for some of the democratic reforms we cherish already, but I think we'll have them to thank for the ones that are coming tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming here today. For those of you online, if you'll send me your World of Warcraft ID, I do owe you 1 month of a free session. Double Dog dare you to do it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Gastil, for that talk. And for anyone that arrived just a few minutes after we started, my name is Maria Zubin, and I'm assisting with the Center for Public Involvement. And I'm going to get cozy with John as we go through the Q&A portion of this evening for the benefit of our webinar participants, of which there are approximately 90 from a multitude of countries. So I will be speaking here and also into this mic, and we'll have to tag team if you don't mind.
I don't.
Okay. So I will be taking questions from the audience, and we'll start there, and then Asia will be assisting by providing John some questions from our online participants. So we will start with our first question. Is there anyone that has one? Just right in front. Yes, please.
Okay, John, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
One of the traditions in this participatory democracy thinking is that it's somehow untarnished by communication, that no one packages anything or spins anything. It's a beautiful process. And I admire that, but I think all of these examples tonight show that, in fact, information does have to be packaged. There has to be real thought into communicating. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about that. The question here is, how do you get effective communication without losing the sense it's impartial and fair?
Sorry, I'll interrupt and just repeat the question for our webinar participants. So how do you get effective communication through the process, the deliberative process, without it seeming impartial or unfair?
So I'll try to give a kind of shotgun answer to this, because there can actually be lots of different micro questions. So, and I'm going to focus here on the Oregon case. As I said, that's the one I most directly studied. So the first thing is, sometimes you need to worry about how to frame the question. In this case, in British Columbia, for instance, the question was put to the people, but somebody put it, right? So when you're framing questions, one thing you can do is be incredibly inclusive. Try to identify key stakeholders and get them at the table, and you might actually be surprised at how eager they are to frame a question that will then be studied, because they're all convinced that they're going to win. That's one great thing about sort of egocentrism in democracy. There's a second communication problem, which is, let's say we get our Citizens Initiative Review panel together, which is not a framing problem. The issue is defined by the measure on the ballot. It's yes or no on that. But now you've got a problem of who do we invite? Who are our expert witnesses? Who's the pro and con? And the pro and con isn't too hard. But who are your neutral experts? One of the things they did is, in Oregon, they created a huge menu, and then the citizens themselves, over the course of the event, got to pick and choose who they wanted to hear from. I don't know if there were some broken hearts from those who weren't circled, but that gave them some control over that. And then, as far as the message they sent out, they saw it as a communication problem. Those Oregonians did. They were editing their statement. Some of them stayed up very late that night, fussing over words, and they kept saying to each other, let's not write this for, a PhD. Let's write this for the person who's reading this. So I think there can be an awareness of it at every step of the process.
And our next question will come from our webinar participant, Salim from Colombia. How do you think there must be a relationship between democracy innovations and the level of trust of the people in the government? Efficiency or transparency on the decision process?
That's a great question. I'm going to argue that there's kind of a two-step process that I would recommend. If a public official came to me and said, I have political will right now to do some of this, but I've got problems with legitimacy and perceptions that were not trustworthy. I think your first step is to empower the public. And that's what you saw the BC Liberals did, right? They didn't say, hey, we've got a great new electoral system. We just want almost every seat, and trust us, this new one's going to be even better, right? Whoa, you're going to cook it. Right? No, they handed it over to citizens. So give power up, give it to the citizens, and let the citizens start having a relationship with each other. These small random samples and panels and so on can start interacting with the public directly. And you don't miss your chance to say, do you realize why that's there? We put that there. We did that. I'm not going to say anything, but we did that. Right? Some trust is building up that you're actually helping to facilitate citizens working directly with citizens, getting to know each other, trust each other. I mean, that's part of the reason this is it's advantageous to do participatory budgeting and so on. You can get credit for giving the power away. The deliberative poll is a process I didn't talk about, but the advocates of that process love pointing out the Chinese example, where basically a municipal government said, would you people stop screaming at us? You hate everything we do. We're going to empower you to decide. Here's 14 different projects. Pick one and shut up. It's China, baby. And they did that. And that's incredibly popular. Everyone wanted to talk about deliberative democracy in China because, oh my God, it gets you off the hook. Right? So you can actually build up some legitimacy. But then, if you have that legitimacy, you might insert yourself back into the process a little more actively. And you can find ways of having the potential to amend and revise or have processes be advisory. When I talked with some folks here in Edmonton, I was saying about advisory processes. That's great if you want to advise government, but what usually happens then is government says, great, okay, thanks. That might be useful, it might not, but I really appreciate it. I hope you all have a great week. Goodbye. What you need at that point is, if it really is advisory, you need a commitment right from the beginning from the government to say, when you give us advice, we are going to respond to it substantively, precisely, and directly to you and anyone else who cares to listen. I can't tell you that we're going to do what you recommend. We are elected and responsible for and accountable for the decisions, but we're also now accountable for explaining them, justifying them, giving arguments for both the things that we agree with you on and the things we don't. And I guarantee you, the first government that does that, be a little judicious, do some of the things they recommend, but when you don't do some, make a big fuss about the fact that you're not doing what they recommended and why. And tell them, it might be something like, that's outside our fiscal scope, but I have an idea of maybe we can pursue a grant next year in a competition and maybe we can do something. Or, you know what, that's unconstitutional. We can debate this, but we had our legal counsel check and they don't think we can do that. Wouldn't that be amazing if government said, no, because, not no, but I'm going to give you this cool ticket, which you can take for a free, cappuccino. Okay? No, give them a reason.
All right, we'll take another question from the audience. Yes.
Yeah. My question is just related to, I would like to thank you for your talk, first of all.
You're welcome.
And my question is just related to countries where democracy was kind of imposed in a modern way. And I'm going to frame around that.
Hit me with a for instance to help out.
For instance, and that's my second part. For instance, let's say Mexico, for example, where 60 people don't really fully human rights. How would you implement just across the Florida, for example, we're assuming they know they have an education, they can read and write. How would you just come across to explain what you're trying to explain to people that cannot even read and write? So that was my question.
So just to reiterate, the question is in reference to democracies or countries that have had democracy imposed on them in a modern way, and how they may have some struggles with understanding the deliberative democracy concept.
Sí. Muchas gracias para el ejemplo. Y la pregunta es sobre Mexico, okay? My Spanish is about that good and I'm stopping. But at least I got some. Grew up in San Diego, so, what are you going to learn? German? Why? So I started with Kerala for a reason. Now, Kerala actually has a relatively high literacy rate. But people all over India are thinking, okay, maybe Kerala is different, but maybe it's not. Maybe we can really do this. And I guarantee you, a lot of the people participating in those grants above don't have some of the technical skills that you would associate with people in Oregon. All right, now we go to Brazil. Okay, now you've actually got fairly lower literacy rates in a lot of the places using participatory budgeting. You can find all kinds of creative ways of framing and working through problems that don't necessarily involve writing words on a flip chart. Time and again, and we're going to go to Oregon and British Columbia, when you do these processes, especially if you have a public official in the room, a couple things happen. The public official says, "Why, this doesn't look like the public that I see. It actually looks like the public I have a feeling is out there, but when I have a hearing or something, all I see are the educated policy experts or the really angry person with an axe to grind. But they always see someone sitting around that table who looks like they don't want to play Scrabble because they don't have a big vocabulary. And you can see that they're not volunteering to write things down. And when you get kind of technical, they might start looking at someone in the process who they've started to trust, that they know during the break they can say, what did that word mean? I don't want to ask, but what did it mean? But time and again, you see those people, over the course of a multi-day process, starting to take charge, stepping up and saying, okay, now we promised we wouldn't forget this thing. Remember she came in here and she told us, don't forget that thing, you forgot the thing. I remember the thing, did you? And they have a certain power and authority because you can tell that they have risen so far in terms of their comfort with the process. Now, I want to stress something that Oregon did that a lot of these processes failed to do. They trained the participants. 5-day process. The first day was all about how to critically analyze an argument. What exactly is our job? What would this look like? And the first week was kind of rocky because they were trying to explain a process no one had ever done. But the second week, they got 2 people from week 1 and said, trust us, they can explain it to you, and it goes like this. And everyone was on board, and it was easy as pie the second week. The point is that whether we're talking about a country like Mexico where democracy drops out of the sky, and frankly people are skeptical at local, state, or national level, but it really is a democracy, but you put them in a process like this, you give them some real authority, or at least the chance that they know they're going to get a response. They really tend to rise to the occasion, and if you're flexible with your process, you can accommodate all kinds of different literacies and so on. The deliberative poll makes a big show about the fact that they've done a deliberative poll in Europe in over 20 languages. So there can be all kinds of barriers to these processes. Some of them require some money to solve, but some of them, fortunately, require a little bit more faith and a lot of procedural creativity.
And our next question from webinar participant Margaret in Perth, Australia is, has there been any research on the psychology aspects of deliberative democracy? For example, the influence of group psychology.
Right. I believe it's pronounced, Margaret will probably agree with me, Perth. Group psychology, okay. Yes, absolutely. We care about groups and group psychology, and I'm going to give you 2 little, one sort of research note and then a process note. The research note is this. A lot of people are familiar with an experiment by Solomon Asch. It was actually a long series of experiments on conformity. And if you don't know about this, it's pretty straightforward. 12 people in a room. You're the last one of 12. The experimenter holds up a card with 3 lines on it. They're apparently different lengths, and the experimenter starts asking people one by one to say out loud which line is longest. And people keep saying it's line 2, line 2, line 2, and you're the last person, and line 2 sure does look shorter than line 3. And you're thinking, do I say it's line 3, or am I just an idiot? Is this one of this is probably some kind of optical illusion, right? And it's line 2, and I just don't, so how many people say line 2? Well, it turns out that something like 20% actually said line 2, which is wrong. Line 3 is longer. Can't you see it? And that's the thing we all remember. And when we put together a process like this, we get nervous and we say, oh my God, Solomon Asch was right. We're going to conform. It's going to be crazy. But they forget, he was an experimentalist. You manipulate the variables. Here's a variable. What if one of those, and those 11 people are all actors, of course. What if one of those other people, one of those actors, says line 3? So you've got now 10 people said, oh, line 2 is longest. And one person said, I think it's line 3. And it comes to you. It's almost impossible to get you to say line 2. Because there is one other crazy person in the room, and you're whipped out, right? If you've ever heard the song Alice's Restaurant, right? 2 people, now you're comfortable. 3 people, and you have a movement, right? You're going to change these people. And that's why you don't want your groups to be too small, but all you need is just a little diversity. And, some processes, actually, if I can go to Australia, the Australian Citizens Parliament was very careful. When they got together their 150 or so Australians, they said, you know what, we're doing a random sample, but we're going to make sure we have a representative number of Aboriginal Australians, even if it takes a little more work to find them. They've got to be in the room, and there's got to be more than one. I don't even care if statistically that group gets one representative. There's got to be more than one. So that during the break they can look at each other and go, wow, did your table say something incredibly racist? Yeah, they kind of did. You too? Yeah. Maybe we should say something about it, right? If you're there by yourself, you're kind of like, ooh, I don't want to be the jerk. You know, and who are you going to ask? So the funny consequence of this is sometimes when you're designing process, you don't want a perfectly random sample. Sometimes you want to not only stratify it, but you want to bump up some of the marginalized, underrepresented, or just fewer in number parts of the population, just so they've got a buddy there so they can survive the Solomon Asch test. The other thing I'll give you is a procedural innovation that I love that we did in Oregon is everything was hunky-dory for 4 days, and then on the 5th day, you have to break into the pro and con side on the ballot measure because they're going to write what they think are the best pro arguments for this measure, and another caucus is going to write what they think are the best con arguments. And that's the first time in the process they're not all at the table together, right? They break up. Well, wouldn't it be tragic if that's where it ended? Because they could just kind of drift off and start writing crazy stuff. And what if there's only 2 people who have one view? God knows what they're going to say, right? So what they did is they said those caucuses can write their own statements, but then they have to come back together as a full group and read them to each other and be accountable to each other. As it had turned out on Measure 73, the 24 people, remember this was an incredibly popular mandatory minimum, 21 of the people wound up recommending against supporting that. 21 out of 24 turned on something that was polling at 70 plus. And what about those 3 people, right? Well, they actually got a really important fact wrong by a magnitude of 10. And the other side said, when they read that, they said, ooh, I don't think that's right. Let's sit down, let's talk, let's look at that. They didn't control it. The 3 people could still put whatever they wanted in that little part of the statement, but they fixed it. The next week, it was a much more evenly divided split on medical marijuana, and both sides said things to the other side like, oh, I don't think that's, I think technically actually we need to change that word because that's a little misleading. Let me explain why. And the changes happened across the board in both cases. That's not always going to happen, but the point is the worst sort of distortions in group process happen when you're kind of isolated and you're seeing some things to try to not make people too isolated. Keep them together so that they can actually learn from each other through that process.
And a question from the audience? Yes.
You provide like really interesting visual examples, and furthermore, like I've been fortunate enough to be part of some programs we've done at the university. But the question that I have kind of concerns what happens outside and after the deliberative process. That is, I think it's pretty crucial in order for deliberative democracy to gain momentum to kind of build up a culture that favors deliberative processes. And so I guess my question is more, how do you build that momentum and that social progression towards deliberation?
So the question is, how do you build the momentum in the deliberative democracy process, not necessarily within the process itself, but external to it?
You start with what you got. And you have to do kind of a cultural inventory to figure out what you've got. So the example of Mexico, for instance, is just going to have a different starting point. The reason I brought up Ned Crosby in the details there, I love that he started with the phrase citizens jury, because that was the hook in the U.S. That was what they got. Remember, people take the jury for granted, but once he put it in a metaphor, they were like, oh yeah, we do kind of know how to do that. And it kind of works. Yeah, I actually really like it. That was his connection. Now, it took 3 decades to kind of tool it into something that got institutionalized in a way he'd never expected it quite to be. And now he's actually doing citizen juries on political campaigns. He's done this once before where you're actually evaluating candidates through a citizen's jury. Now, will people get that? You're pretty far from the jury by now. Maybe they'll get it. Over time, I think these ideas do start to percolate through the culture. I don't mean to be too wonky on history, but when we think about how the jury came about, I think that gives us a little bit of a glimpse. People just do crazy things and cause change. In England, there was a Quaker who'd been preaching out in the square, and that was a crime. Quakers were like totally not cool in England at the time. And so they brought him in and said to the jury, all right, well, here's the trial, da-da-da-da-da. Now it's your turn to render a verdict, i.e. convict him, which is what the Crown, of course, expects. The judge is very clear about this. The jury goes off, deliberates, comes back and says, we're hung. And the judge is like, are you kidding me? Go back upstairs. The jury comes back down and says, it's getting late, we can't quite reach agreement. The judge says, okay, that's cool, no problem, I'm going to lock you in. See you tomorrow morning. They come back, the next day, and now they're kind of peevish. And they say to the judge, the jury finds that he was in the square and was like talking and stuff. What's your verdict? Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have one. The judge says, All right, so, and these guys are causing trouble, right? These are, Occupy, Court of England, right? And the judge says, okay, that's cool. I'm just going to put you in debtor's prison. Not for an indeterminate period of time. You just have to pay off your debt, which is, roughly $1 million or $2 in modern currency. See ya. So off they go to prison. Well, this kind of thing happens in England all the time, right? You're in prison and there's no reason or rhyme to it, and there you are and you're stuck. Have a good rest of your life. Such as it is probably short and kind of brutal. But one of the people in prison has this crazy idea. And you've got to think how crazy this is. Who put them there? The judge, right? So the guy says, I'd actually like to sue the court. Who are you going to sue to? The court? Yeah. And the higher court finally says, hey, you know what? This whole jury thing, we kind of built it so that we weren't on the hook for all these decisions. Because if you trace it back a few centuries, it was like the Norman Conquerors saying, oh my gosh, somebody's wound is infected, so you clearly stole the cattle. And everybody's like, he stole the cattle? He was in like a different county. And they're like, oh, that's what the hand says. And the Norman Conquerors are like, this isn't going to fly. We're going to have a bunch of you people come together and say who did what, and it's your fault if you don't like the verdict, right? That eventually kind of grows into a jury. And the judges in the highest court said, yeah, I think that's kind of the point, that you people are on the hook for whether or not this person committed a crime. So, yeah, you know what? The judge is wrong. The jury can come out of debtor prison, and we've just established that juries have independence. Now, was the cultural situation ripe for that? Doesn't really seem like it. It seems like kind of, if I don't know what a Hail Mary pass would be in Canadian football, maybe you're on the 1 yard line because you got 25 yards of end zone. So you just bomb it to the back corner and you give it, to some chunky guy who's supposed to be blocking and he's like, I'm open. And you throw kind of a wobbling duck and he catches it and you're like, see, told you, time was ripe for that touchdown. You just work with what you got, and sometimes you don't got a lot, but you got to try. It's a sports metaphor. Roll with it.
And our next question from our webinar participants, David in San Francisco. What do you think of proposals to replace one elected house of a legislature with a randomly selected house?
Yeah, so a lot of places in the world are bicameral, right? In the United States, every state except Nebraska, go Nebraska, has a House and a Senate. And sometimes you look at these two bodies and you think, okay, what was the point of that again? At the national level, the Senate and the House in the United States, they have lots of kind of interesting differences in functions or dysfunctions. But a lot of times you really do look at these states with two bodies and think, I'm not so clear on why we need two of these. And Nebraska, again, was like, I don't see a reason. We have one. It's awesome. But in some of these states, I actually think that's a great place to say, why don't we chuck one of those and try a different one? If you're really paranoid that this randomly, appointed legislature is going to be too bizarre for words, don't give it a lot of power. Give it a few things, right? Maybe give it a veto. Maybe they have to get 2/3 to do anything. I don't know. You constrain them. But let's see what happens. I actually think it's a fantastic idea. It's been knocking around in various forms for quite a while. You can go back to Ernest Callenbach, who wrote an obscure book I found in the public library once advocating this. And I thought, wow, I am the other person in the room who sees that one line is longer. I'm with Ernest Callenbach. We're both crazy, but it's cool now. He also wrote a novel called Ecotopia, which is terrible but kind of fun to read. And yeah, it has random assemblies and all that. Ernest Callenbach.
And a question from our audience. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Since you are an expert in the deliberative democracy, I can't help but think of Switzerland, and I'm sure you know how the process, how they decide on how to do that. Can you think what give us your opinion on that?
And the question is in reference to Switzerland.
And direct democracy.
And direct democracy.
Yeah. So, in general, I'm actually very skeptical of direct democracy through referendums and initiatives and so on, because I like to ask, you notice I've talked a lot about the deliberative quality of these small groups, right? But I'm actually equally interested in a different level of analysis. Was the election deliberative? What they're trying to do in Oregon is have a microcosm deliberate and then pass along information to a mass public that might at least do kind of a thin deliberation. But at least it's something. You know, it's funny, when you think about a legislature or a council, ask a councilor or a legislator, what do you do when a complex bill comes up? And they'll say, oh, well, we have like a legal analysis, group. We have all kinds of people, go up to the federal level. They have a whole budget off, all kinds of technical support, right, to help them every step of the way, because they don't know what this stuff is. I mean, they weren't elected because they're, sequenced the genome, but here they're having to vote on legislation on genome sequencing, right? The public doesn't have that. They're not anything like it. And, you can't just give them a legislative council, so to speak. It's complicated for a lot of reasons. But the point is, what they're trying to do in Oregon is they're trying to say, well, how about if we just take your peers? You don't have to trust experts, but trust your peers. And we're going to give them the experts. Not for months. We're not going to send them off to the Capitol to, change their address and make their kids wonder, what happened? Where'd you go? No, we're just going to say a week. And what are they going to figure out? They're going to figure out a lot. And in a lot of cases, they're going to see that something stinks on one side or the other of a measure. With Measure 73, for instance, the proponents of it were actually quite compelling on the first day of argument. I found myself thinking, oh, wow, maybe this is actually kind of a good idea. I wonder what the con side is going to say. And the con side had some good arguments. Both sides had victims on both sides. I heard victims on the pro side, and I thought, ooh, those victims have some credibility. And then the other side, we have victims that say this is a bad idea. It's like, ooh, that kind of took care of that. And as the process went on, the pro side kept having trouble supporting their arguments. And they got desperate. Their Hail Mary pass to the back of the 25-yard end zone. Hey, whatever works. Go BC Lions. They said, we're just going to show a video of car crashes. And that's going to break your heart, and you're going to vote for this legislation. And, if you do an effective ad, right, a 30-second ad that's got this emotional appeal, just the right music and everything, it can be killer, right? Ask Newt Gingrich. But at the Citizens Initiative Review, when they put up their video, you saw people trying to be respectful, right? Trying to say, okay, this is how you're using your time. Okay. About 30 seconds in, people started to look at each other. It's the Solomon Ash thing. Am I the only one who thinks this is insane? What are they doing? We clearly needed more evidence. This is rock music, and now it's country music. What is it? 9 Inch Nails? Did you look at the average age of us? A few people left the room, not out of disrespect, but because they were so upset with what was happening. And now with the car crashes, they were being disrespected. It was just a blatant emotional appeal, and it just wasn't going to fly. And then when it was over, they didn't shout or scream or say, how dare you? They just said, thank you for coming, goodbye, and now let's hear from the con side. My point being, in Switzerland, that doesn't happen. And so I'm very skeptical. I mean, proud tradition of direct democracy, but people are still just filling out ballots. How long do they spend studying these issues? In a lot of places, there is no official voter's guide anyway, so you don't even have a summary of the legislation. You just have a title. And they focus group these titles like crazy. If you get a good title for your initiative, go ahead and collect the signatures. Spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're in. It's going to take millions of dollars to beat that title. But if you put that title in a Citizens Initiative Review and the actual text is bad, it's dead in the water. That's not in Switzerland. So again, I remain skeptical of that process until you give citizens some kind of a process that helps them in their busy lives get just a little more analysis, maybe from their peers.
Okay, and in the interest of time, we'll just take our last question here from our online participant, Daria. What is your perspective on engaging people that aren't interested or you think they're not interested in participating? How far do you go to bring people into participating, the participatory process?
Sure. Kind of depends on the process you have. One approach that is used sometimes, this was talked about in some of our meetings, talking about processes that might be used here in Edmonton, is they call it a third and a third and a third. A third of those people are randomly selected. A third of them volunteer. They're obviously interested. And a third of them are kind of recruited, all right, through existing kind of civil society organizations. And that answers the question from each of those in different ways. With the random sample, people are paid to do these things, and paid good money, not jury money like $10 a day. In New Mexico, we had a process we thought was very important. We paid people $250 for 1 day of work. 80% participation rate. Cold calling people, right? 80% of the people we reached on the phone showed up. $250. I forget what we did. We like doubled the median wage or something. Thought that would work. So there's one way of getting to, and some of those people, not necessarily interested in whatever it was we were doing, but they're there and they're happy and they'll get their check at the end. And they are champions in that process, I guarantee you. And it's partly, I think it's a Western culture thing. You give people money, they're like, you respect me, don't you? Right? And they take it very seriously. The media says, people got paid to participate. Isn't that goony? They'll get over that after a couple of these. Second one is the volunteers, right? So the third and the third and the third, you can get people who are very interested. You want to make sure that overall you're pretty representative so your volunteers don't skew things. But sure, have some people who are super excited and motivated and let them come in. You might have to choose them by lot among the people who want to. That third group, though, that mobilization, that's where you can get some people who wouldn't normally be interested or wouldn't even necessarily know it's happening. But you use existing social capital. So let's say, for instance, there's a community, a new immigrant community, that you're actually very concerned about. It's a public transportation issue. They're kind of in a remote area. You work with leaders in their community, and you don't bring the leaders. You have the leaders recruit people who would never come to something like this. Why do they come? Because the person they trust and respect asks them to. And then again, the process hopefully takes care of itself. They get drawn in, they have a great time, and they say, wow, I might come back to this on my own. And in fact, that's one of the findings we have from our research is that when people do these processes, with the jury system in the U.S., that is not voluntary, people. Half the people showing up in the studies we were doing did not want to be there. But regardless of that, we were finding all kinds of behavioral and attitudinal changes as a result of deliberating on a jury. You became more likely to be engaged in public life. So even if you come there against your will or because you're doing a favor for a buddy, the process can still inspire you. Because it reminds you that democracy is self-government. And it's one thing to fill out a ballot. That's good. I'm not knocking the ballot. I'm knocking it a little. But it's another thing to sit in the chair and realize, oh my gosh, this is in my hands. Oh yeah, that's what that means. And that can be a little bit transformative for some of us. And over time, that can add up to really quite a social transformation. Thank you again for your time. Happy to answer any more questions, but thanks for coming and thanks for being online. Rock and roll.
Before you go tonight, we're going to give out a copy of one of John's books. It's a very practical book for those of you who are involved in any kind of public participation activity. It's a practical book, but also it includes research supporting some of the very practical ideas in the book. And so I'm going to ask John to help us give this away. So if you can just hang tight for one more moment, because we want to thank Councillor Karen Leibovici for being here tonight. And Erica Schultz in the Learning Engagement Office of Faculty Extension helped us to set up the webinar support. Thank you to Rodrigo Loyola and his staff and volunteers at the Global Education Program. We had, as I mentioned, Asia Webby organizing and managing the webinar here. She had a colleague online as well helping to organize, Erica Smith. She's not here, but we want to thank her as well. And of course, Maria for doing such a great job of moderating our question session. Our partners, as I mentioned earlier, are the University of Alberta Faculty Extension and the City of Edmonton, who are the partners for the Centre for Public Involvement. John, before we give out the book, I wanted to mention another bit of Canadian trivia, which I know you love, is that you mentioned due south. Paul Gross is a
national treasure.
Yeah, graduated at the University of Alberta.
Is that right?
There you go. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, one from the EFA program here at the University of Alberta. What I thought we could do, John, is ask people a trivia question. We could do it in a more random fashion, but I think that's the best we can do tonight. So I'm going to ask you to think back to that first case that John mentioned in India. What was the name of the city that he? Oh, right there, right now. The hand went up over here. Sorry.
That was the state. That's a cruel question. You'd have to know the... is that good enough? The state is good enough?
I think that's what we're looking for. So I will have this for you. Yes, congratulations.